Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another RISB Masterclass webinar. My name is Sudha Niles. I'm the GM of products at RISB, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We also have a special guest with us, Dr. Michelle Zybots. She's a senior lecturer at the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UTS. So she will be our presenter today, and she's going to present and provide a presentation on the countdown to the inevitable resource scarcity, decarbonisation, and the electrification of rail freight in Australia. And I'm sure many of you have sort of registered for this webinar, really keen to have a look and understand some of the key ideas that she's going to bring about today and some of her research work. Let me quickly read through Michelle, her background. Michelle Zybots is a transport planner who specializes in analyzing sustainable urban passenger transport systems. Her research and consultancy work and teaching combine operational, behavioral, and governance features related to multimodal urban transport networks. Michelle is a senior lecturer in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering within the Faculty of Engineering and Information Technology, where she lectures in transportation planning and engineering. Michelle is also the co-leader of Program 5, Transport Economics Planning and Service Engineering within the UTS Transport Research Centre, which is a multidisciplinary cross-faculty research hub within UTS dedicated to applied transport research, teaching, and learning program within a customer service paradigm. Michelle combines her knowledge of more sustainable public and active transport, which is walking and cycling, models as a means of reducing road traffic congestion through her specialization in induced traffic growth, having completed a PhD in the topic at the Institute of Sustainable Futures at UTS. Michelle has since acted as an expert witness and an expert referee, carried out empirical analysis and joint authored reports for several Australian state and New Zealand government agencies on this aspect of travel behavioral change. Michelle, I won't hold back too long. I'll pass this time over to you, and I'll come back again for our questions at the end. And for those of us who are participating, a quick note, a reminder to put your questions through the chat channel that is available on the Teams meeting presentation, and we'll provide them at the end of the discussion I'll ask those questions to Michelle at the end of the presentation. Over to you, Michelle.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sudha. Well, we'll now do that part of the presentation where we try to get the technology working, and hopefully it is working. If someone could give me a heads up, that would be really good. So I'm hoping you can see.
Yes, we can see that, Michelle.
You can see that? Okay, lovely. All righty. Well, thank you, Sudha. And thank you, everyone, for coming along. This is parts of a presentation that I gave at the recent RISB Horizons conference that was held at UTS. And as I was saying to Sudha and Reggie, a large portion of it involved a whole lot of questions that the folks from the floor were invited to get involved with via an exercise that we call spectrum questions. So I've not included those in this presentation, but it's a presentation that is intended to start a conversation or add to an existing conversation about, I guess, really the electrification of rail freight in Australia and the electrification of transport more broadly. So as Sudha mentioned, I'm actually a passenger transport specialist. So it's very unusual to have a passenger transport specialist here talking to all of you about rail freight, when I guess most of you probably have far more experience in rail freight than what I do. But the reason why I'm talking about this is because of work that I've been involved with recently in my now hometown, which is Lithgow in New South Wales. And Lithgow, as you'll see, is a community that is needing to transition. It's seen as a coal mining community by most people. but it has a very strong rail manufacturing past, and it's now hoping to not reinvent it so much as revisit that and or make, sorry, to make that its past, to make its existing rail manufacturing a lot bigger than what it currently is. So I'm going to talk about that, as well as a few issues around resource scarcity, that's oil scarcity, and also issues around climate change, or decarbonisation, as we like to call it. Okay, so this is basically the presentation, I guess. There's a little bit more there on point 3 with the examples that I'm going to give from Lithgow. But I like to talk about the inputs to transport, which is the fuels, and the outputs or externalities, which are the emissions. And then as a strategic transport planner, what I like to do is to try and find alignment points between those, the issues around inputs and the issues around outputs, because at the moment or in the past, there's been a hell of a lot of fights and arguments about that. But I really do feel that we're hopefully moving beyond that, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to show that in this presentation to you. Okay, well, let's start off with a quick look at what's happening with oil production and consumption in Australia. So in this line here, this portion of the graph here, we have oil production in Australia in the dark grey, and then this line up the top here, and this line here should be filled in and not dotted, but in this line up here we have consumption. So this is from a piece of work that I did back in 2011, and we've updated it, and we were pretty spot on, actually. So that's good to know. But basically what this is showing us is that around about 70 to 80% of Australia's domestic oil consumption is being made up from imports from overseas. So what we're able to produce here in Australia, it peaked around here in the year 2000, and it's been in decline ever since that time. And that's very similar to the situation that exists now in many, many different countries. So if we look at this next slide, then we can see the other part to the inputs to transport, and that is where it is that fuel is being refined. And what we find with Australia is that Australian oil is not being refined onshore, and what we're doing is we're importing all of the refined product, or the petrol and diesel. So a lot of that is coming from the super refineries in Singapore. So this is Australian imports for diesel, and over here we have Australian imports for petrol. You can see that most of that's coming from Singapore, but increasingly a lot of it's coming from other parts, largely from within the Asia Pacific. And I guess the question there is, well, you know, is that a situation that we are relaxed and comfortable with? Is that a good thing? That's a question I'd like to throw out there. If we have a look at what's happening with world or global oil production, what we can see is that around about the time of the global financial crisis, that was around about the time when global oil production was peaking. So we can see that in this blue line. And we began to see big spikes in the price, the global price of oil around that time as well. In response, what happened was that a lot of oil was then suddenly, if you can call this suddenly, being acquired from what we call non-conventional sources. So it was, we suddenly saw a big increase, which is this area here that's shaded in the yellow. We began to see a big increase in the oil that was being mined or sourced from shale oil. Now, mining oil from shale is relatively expensive by comparison with oil from conventional sources. And the other difficulty, I guess, is that there's just not as much of this around. And when this begins to go, this source of oil goes into decline, then it's probably going to be a much steeper rate of decline than what we can see in cases like this here in Australia. So the point I'd make here is that oil is a finite resource. Without going into it in a lot of detail, it is a finite resource, and there's a lot of discussion now about when are we likely to see difficulties with its supply again. That's a very complex system, the global oil production system. But generally speaking, a lot of the commentators that I watch and listen to have been saying it's time to really think about alternatives, because we could come into some problems within this side of 5 years. So we've got this side of 5 years to start really, I guess, looking at alternatives. Now, if that's the case, then when we look at other problems like climate change or the need to reduce emissions, then we can begin to see that maybe there's some alignment here between the inputs to transport and the outputs. So in the past, what we've seen is a very contentious sort of debate. It's often referred to as the climate wars, and the science is disputed, and this and that happens, and everyone starts yelling and shouting at each other and what have you. And I, as a practitioner, I don't see that as particularly constructive, and I think that's probably the way that most practitioners see this debate. But I guess one of the points I'd like to lead on here is that if we bring the issues that we're confronting, or we're going to have to confront with energy inputs to transport, then, well, maybe doing the right thing on climate change and reducing emissions, maybe that's not as hard as what it's been perhaps made out to be, or the way in which it's been presented in some of the popular debates. So if we look at something like the climate change bill, which was passed in 2022, and we look, it's a fairly simple piece of legislation. The key point in that piece of legislation is that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 43% below 2005 levels by 2030. And you might recall that there was a lot of debate about that at the time when this was passed. There are a lot of people saying, oh, this is just not ambitious enough. I guess one of the points to make is that this is actually quite a difficult target to achieve. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it is actually quite difficult to achieve. So if we look at this is data from 2021, which is a bit old, but the transport sector is our third biggest sector for transport emissions. And at this time, we were producing around 90.9 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Now it's a bit higher. So if we go to this next slide, we can see some of that. So here's the rate of emissions in 2005, and the climate change bill is saying that we need to reduce our emissions by 43% of this level. Before COVID, we were up around 100 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent each year in emissions. It then dropped quite dramatically. I don't know that the emissions website has been updated, but we are assuming that we've climbed back to about 100 million tonnes. So that's the number or the value that I've been using. But if we go back to what the legislation says, and we look at a 43% reduction from here, then it means that we need to look at reducing our emissions to 46.4 million tonnes per annum by 2030, and that's actually probably about a 53% reduction from what our current emission levels are. It's now, to state the very obvious, it's now 2024, so we've got about 6 years in which to do that. And I'd say, without wanting to be a downer on any of these things, I'd say that that's very difficult to achieve, and we're really going to struggle with that. So one of the things that colleagues and I have been doing at UTS is trying to find different ways to think about it. There are obvious ways, which is that we need to convert a lot of our rolling stock to electric, or we need to electrify the transport sector, and then see the transport sector, wherever possible, running off electricity from renewable sources in order to meet that target. And I'll get to that in a moment. But before doing that, we'll just have a quick look at this. So this graph here shows the mode split, or which sectors are producing what amounts. So as we can see, the rail transport sector, which is this small line through here, it's not a huge part of the overall transport equation or picture, but it is a part of it. And as you can see, it's also been growing in the last decade or so. So in order to reach that target, every sector matters. And we've really got a lot of work to do in each of these sectors. So even though rail is just a small component, or a relatively small component of the picture overall, it's still an area where we need to do some work. All right, so what I'd like to do now is go off on a bit of a tangent, which is what academics like to do. But one of the things I was asked to do was to try and give people an understanding of what these numbers mean, because it's great to throw around millions of tons of CO2 equivalent and talk in that language, but it's also good to get some kind of relatable idea of just how big these numbers are and what they mean. So, borrowing from another program that's currently going on in Lithgow, which is all about the use of industrial hemp, of all things. I'll show you this here. What's really interesting is that there's a bit of a push now by different people to think about sequestration, or that is capturing carbon. So there was, as you'll probably recall, a lot of discussion about carbon capture technologies that were being discussed within the energy production industry and sector. We've not seen any new technologies or working technologies come out of that after a decade or more worth of discussion, and also $3 billion or close to $3 billion worth of investment in that technology from the federal government. So there's now a lot of talk about biosequestration. And in order to make biosequestration successful, you need to find a plant or a crop that could be grown that really absorbs carbon at a very fast and rapid rate. And there are two plants generally which are understood to be very good at this. One of them is bamboo, and the other is industrial hemp. So industrial hemp has a bit of a reputational problem and issue. It doesn't have a great social license to go ahead as a crop at the moment, because although the problem with it is that it's often associated with other with other forms of the plant which are involved in the production of narcotics. But there is a form of industrial hemp that doesn't have THC in it, as it's called, and it can remove somewhere between 22 and 15 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare when it's grown. So if we were to start looking at biosequestration of the emissions that come from the Australian transport sector, then basically, and what I'm doing now is I'm just putting, I'm showing you a part of New South Wales that has the New South Wales Central Western Lithgow. Sydney is down here. And this is New South Wales. So if we wanted to absorb all of the emissions from the transport sector across Australia each year, we'd basically need to put a land that is as big as this area here under industrial hemp cultivation each year. So that would potentially absorb that 100 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. If we can look at, which is quite a big area. Another way to look at it, oops. Oh, sorry. It's that area there. Okay. Another way to look at it is another way that we've been looking at it in Lithgow, and this is a bit of a segue to my next set of points, and then I'll end on these next bits, which are about Lithgow. Lithgow also is home to one of the country's biggest and oldest coal-fired power stations. This is the Mount Piper power station in Lithgow, and it's at the moment it's the last power station or coal-fired power station that's been listed for closing. It's due to close in 2040, and I think it's about it'll be the last power station left standing. If we go back here, well, to absorb the emissions coming from Mount Piper, we'd need to put an area this big, which is roughly the Lithgow local government area in its entirety. We'd need to put that under industrial hemp cultivation. Now, Lithgow is also, and this slide here is quite important, Lithgow is also an area that, a town that has been in the news recently because of the federal opposition's policy to build nuclear power reactors. So I don't really want to get into that. But headlines like this have been typical, and there's a lot of discussion going on within Lithgow at the moment about what's needed in order to lift our local economy as we transition away from coal. At the moment, our economy is highly dependent on coal, and there's a lot of our jobs. I think it's about 37% of the money or income that flows through Lithgow comes from coal. That's the development of energy from coal or just the mining of coal. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about that as well. There are some groups that have pointed out that we're not just about coal, that Lithgow is actually the birthplace of industrial Australia. There's a lot of different inventions as well as social institutions that have come from Lithgow. And in recent years, one of those inventions, or I'll go back a bit, one of the things that's important about Lithgow is that it had a very big rail manufacturing industry in the past. And there's still rail manufacturing and rail maintenance that goes on within Lithgow, but it's struggling for reasons that I'll reveal in a moment. But despite all of that, there is one of the local rail manufacturers that built the world's first what was called solar train, and it's been in operation for 7 years in Byron Bay. So this is it here. Now, I have to confess that when I first heard about this, I thought, oh, blimey, that really sounds like quite a strange idea, putting solar panels on the roofs of trains and then expecting those trains still to work. But It has worked for passenger trains, for small passenger trains, and it's also been very, very popular with tourists. Now, the folks who did this, the solar train, and some of you may know of Tim Elderton. He's from Elderton Engineering. He's the chap on the left there in the blue shirt. Now, Tim not only wants to build solar trains, or battery electric solar trains, but he's also wanting to or believes that there's a lot of scope for converting diesel freight locomotives to electric power, and it would involve taking the hang on, we'll just get to that in a moment. So it would involve swapping the diesel engines in our existing locomotives and swapping them for electric motors, and then adding a battery tender or like a big battery carriage to the end of these locomotives. And at the moment, the technology is there to provide 4 megawatt hour battery tenders. So this is one of the things that the point of all of this is that there's a lot of discussion now in Lithgow about looking at what it is that could be done in order to develop industries very quickly that could address the two issues that I've talked about earlier, which is the issues around depleting fossil fuels and those resources, and the potential for pricing pressure to come about as the production of those fuels begin to decline, and then also the need to reduce emissions by transforming or shifting our transport fleets over to zero emission vehicles. So I'll just go back here a bit. So in Lithgow, this is an aerial photograph of Lithgow, and up here is the area where the old Lithgow locomotive workshop is located, along with some very big sidings. Now, this is a huge area of the land in Lithgow, and at the moment, it's very much underutilised. So the local community has got a big push on at the moment to bring the Lithgow locomotive workshop back into active use. So they've got an online petition there that with the New South Wales Parliament, and they're asking people to help them by signing that. But the point I'm getting to, I guess, is that in Lithgow we have a case study here, or an example, and there are probably other examples very much like this in other parts of Australia, where if industry generally takes up the request for the need to transform and shift to transition to different technologies that are more in alignment with what's happening with issues in our resource base, and also issues that are happening with environmental issues that are happening with the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that there are alternatives there, and they're actually very good. And I think that, this provides an example of that. The other question that arises on all of this is the question of, well, where does the electricity come from, or where would the electricity come from to run these battery electric trains in all their different forms? And I've been very interested in the issue of curtailment recently. So curtailment refers to the amount of electricity that could potentially, or is already, coming off our existing array of renewables. That's wind power and solar power. And as you can see, for this time period here, during this week, what we can see here are the curtailment levels, or the electricity that was being generated from solar and wind sources that just wasn't used. Now, this looks very small. You might think, oh, gee, there's not much of that here. But, you know, we're talking about hundreds of megawatts. If we look at what happens at other times of the year, like in January and February, when there's a lot more sun around than in the middle of winter, then we're into, you know, we're looking at gigawatts up here. So the point I'm making is that if we go back and think about rail freight's got a wonderful opportunity here to add to our batteries, the scale of the batteries within the system that could be used to soak up a lot of this electricity that at the moment is just not being used at all. And because it's not being used at all, it's potentially very inexpensive. So an idea that I'd like to just throw out there is that those businesses that get on board with the transition to electrifying rail freight are going to be in a better position to, or they're going to be in a position to access very, very cheap energy much more quickly than those that are a little slower and a little more sluggish at taking up that particular opportunity. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for sort of talking through some of the focus at Lithco and some of the work that you have done. So that's really interesting and enlightening. Just to start off, a couple of questions with regards to the electrification of the rail freight itself. I mean, it's understood that when you go down the path of electrification of rail freight itself, the upfront cost is seen as a huge investment. So I guess the question here is, how can we make a compelling economic case for electrification of freight? Given freight, we are talking about traveling all the way from Brisbane to Perth. How do we go about making that, given the current constraints in infrastructure spending? How do we go about making a case for it? And is there any sort of work that you guys have done that will put some light on that? So over to you, Michelle.
Okay, well, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that we have both short haul freight runs and long haul freight runs, and at the moment, battery electric freight locomotives are very viable for a lot of short haul freight runs. And those short haul freight runs are also runs that go through, or often go through, very heavily urbanised areas. So as you would all know, an electric freight locomotive makes a hell of a lot less noise than a diesel freight locomotive, and it also produces a lot less emissions or ambient emissions within the local area. So the advantages with short haul freight runs are not just there for the benefit of the industry partner or the business that is running the locos, but there's also a wide range of benefits for the general community. So that being the case, I think that first up, in answer to your question, there is a case for maybe government assistance, and I gather some of the the first cabs off the rank, if that's an appropriate metaphor, some of the first cabs off the rank with the electrification of rail freight locos have been able to draw on assistance from ARENA, and it might be that the pioneers in this sector can look towards opportunities like that, and it's justified because of the much wider benefits. The second point that I would make is that the upfront costs are coming down. So that example that I've given you, I'm just trying to remember the prices off the top of my head, but I think I think that the 4 megawatt hour battery tender and the conversion that can now come in at about, I think it's $6 or $7 million. I'd really have to go and um,
Sure.
go back to my source for that, and that's something I might do, and then it can be posted out. But the point I would make is that upfront cost is becoming less and less and less. So that's point number two. And I think that $6 to $7 million is less than some of the other battery electric freight trains that are currently being produced or being converted. And I think the size of the battery tender is now up from, I think some of the early versions that are now under construction or are being manufactured, the battery tender is about 1.2 megawatt hours, and now we're already up to 4 megawatt hours. So as you would expect, the technology is getting better, but it's going to get better more rapidly if there is more demand, or maybe just more interest as well. So now I think it's the time for different businesses to put their hand up and say, we're interested in looking at this. So that's the second point. The third point, I guess, is that yes, the upfront costs are much higher, but the ongoing costs for fuel and energy are a hell of a lot less. And not only that, but if you've got very big battery tenders, then it might be the case that within your array, you're able to sell some of the electricity depending on your operations. You might be able to sell some of your electricity back to the grid during times when the sun isn't so bright or the wind isn't blowing so strongly, or there's just a lull in the amount of electricity coming off renewables. So as we shift towards a grid that has much more renewables within it, much more renewable generation within it, there is a need to have a lot more storage embodied within the system. And a point I didn't make was that Lithgow is now home to some of the really big batteries that are being built in New South Wales. I think we've got about 3 on the go at the moment. So one's currently under construction. Another one was just given the green light only a few days ago, and there's a third one that I think is still in the planning and development stage. So there's those 3 points, and eventually I think we're going to end up in a better place where the prices do come down. But the big factor is that we get the opportunity to replace what will become a very high cost import. We're able to replace that with a next to nothing cost domestically produced energy source.
Thanks, Michelle. I think you've sort of addressed the point, the wider impacts and the wider benefits and the social and environmental impacts as a result of using electrification. I think someone also made a comment that in some of the short haul environments that maybe we already have the existing infrastructure due to passenger networks in place, and then maybe that can be reused as well. So that's a interesting point that's been made. And I think more and more the conversation is also turning towards wider community benefit.
Yeah, I think
real,
so.
Return on investment. I think that's more involved. So that's a really good point. Another question here with regards to the technological and logistical challenge in Australia facing transitioning from diesel power to freight to electricity. Are there any other additional issues with regards to transitioning from a logistical point of view into any electrified systems?
Oh, I really don't know, Sudha. I'm sorry. I mean, there's probably loads of them. Yes, I guess there are a lot of issues around, well, where do we, what's the maintenance infrastructure like for these new and emerging types of vehicles? What changes do we need to make to the electrical grid in order to have points in the grid where these battery tenders, for want of a better term, where it is that these are being recharged. You know, do we have a battery tender sharing system going on? The beautiful thing about this is that potentially you can swap battery tenders when they begin to run out. I mean, well, when I say, I make it sound like it's easy. We all know that it's very difficult to stop a train, detach its locomotive from the rest of its carriages, and then take one of the carriages or a battery tender out, and then put a new one in. But the procedures and the infrastructure associated with that as a possibility, I haven't really thought about that very deeply. I don't think anyone really has as yet, but that might be a way in which to extend the range of what can be done with electric freight locomotives. So at the moment, with a 4 megawatt hour battery, you can haul about 2,000 to 3,000 tons of freight for about 120 kilometres in sections of track that aren't electrified. I mean, obviously, if you've got as someone pointed out earlier, where you've got freight going underneath track sections that already has overhead wiring, you can draw down the electricity from the overhead wiring system. It's just when you go beyond that part of the network that you have to do things differently. So, there's another question. And I don't know the answer to this, but it'd be a very interesting one to start looking at. Is it cheaper to put in overhead wiring and extend the reach of the network that has overhead wiring? Is it cheaper to do that, or is it cheaper to start relying on battery tenders? And is the infrastructure required for battery tenders cheaper and easier to implement and manage than putting in vast amounts of overhead wiring?
Thanks, Michelle, and sorry for putting you on the spot with regards to logistics questions, but it's an interesting one to sort of think about. A shameless plug at this particular point in time, RISP's actually had just developed a standard on charging infrastructure for battery operated locomotives, and it takes into consideration the multiple operational constraints and operational requirements on what kind of charging infrastructure can be used to charge. So there'll be some level of, I think, development, the standards being developed to ensure that it supports some of the conversation that takes place. So that's just a bit of a shameless plug in the conversation. There are quite a few questions that are coming up, and I'm just going to pick a few of them as they come through. Look, a couple of comments. They're already using battery locos in iron ore trains in the Pilbara. There are various mechanisms that we are aware of. Here's another question. Due to the limits of battery capacity, time to change requirements would be better to use hydrogen fuel technology while using green power to create hydrogen. I guess the other question I have is, obviously you guys have looked at electrifying systems. Were there any alternative fuel source considered in the process in your thinking to say, well, electrification would be a better option? What was your discovery and finding with regards to that?
Look, I think we need to keep looking at hydrogen, but generally speaking, my understanding is that the amount of energy needed to produce hydrogen, you are losing a lot of energy in the process to produce hydrogen. So I'll just go back here. Because it's a really interesting and important question. So this is how I think hydrogen goes. If you've got these huge amounts of curtailment in your system, and you want to shift to hydrogen, then okay, you've then got a means of using all of this. So that, the question is that something that, is the fact that hydrogen is really not cost effective And you could argue that it's not energy effective either, because the return on investment ratios for hydrogen production are really, really poor. But, and it's a very big but, if you've got so much curtailment in the system, and this is just going to, this is just going to grow over time. If you've got so much curtailment in the system, then does it really matter? And does the costs of developing a whole lot of new distribution infrastructure for hydrogen, is that, can we afford that? Can we justify that, given that we're going to have so much curtailment? The other point I'd make, though, is that there are some folks who are calculating that with the transition to electrification, because we've got to get off gas and we've got to get off other fossil fuels like oil, petrol and diesel. But in that process, the amount of electricity that we're going to have to produce in Australia is going to increase by somewhere between 200% and 300%. So it's not just that our electricity sector has to transition over to zero or low emission forms of energy generation, but we also have to produce just a hell of a lot more of it. So the question I have, and it's not a question I can get even close at all to answering, is that within that mix of needing to increase the amount of electricity that we're producing overall, and the fact that you've got this issue of curtailment within a more renewables-based electricity grid and generation array, does hydrogen sit comfortably within that? And I really don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Are there big advantages to it? I'm really not sure. Is it the case that maybe hydrogen is a much better option for these long haul rail freight routes, but for the short haul rail freight routes, well, electricity is an obvious one, and we can start doing that now, and it can be relatively cost effective. We don't need hydrogen for that. So they're the sorts of questions that a lot of us are mulling over at the moment, and I'm sure that there are a lot of academics around and professionals as well that are within professional consultancies within Australia that would be just chafing at the bit to want to go and have a look at trying to answer those questions.
Thanks, Michelle. Look, I think you are raising some key questions for us to actually think about in the industry as a whole in these sort of discussions. And I'm sure there are some work being done, and I'm sure there'll be people on different camps that they would probably look at different technologies as a means to achieve the same outcome. One of the questions here I've got here with regards to decarbonisation is this, has the decarbonisation impacts of producing batteries and solar panels and extracting essential elements being sort of considered in the conversation and been peer reviewed to ensure it's justifiably lower in carbon emissions? So this is a bit of a question around what sort of research work is being done in that area to understand, are we actually looking further down the chain on producing these things, and what sort of trade-offs that are taking place?
Yes, there has been. I don't know of work that's been done for rail freight and battery electric trains, battery electric freight trains. Maybe that's something we can do in the not too distant future. But I know that it has been done for passenger cars. And generally what's been found is that the emissions that are generated from when mass producing battery electric cars, they are slightly higher than what they are for producing an internal combustion engine powered car. But over the life of of a battery electric car, is that the generally speaking, the emissions are much lower. They're a hell of a lot lower. And a lot of that also depends on what the electricity source is for recharging that vehicle. So if you're recharging your battery electric car, as I do from my rooftop solar here at Lithgow, so I live on a farm and we're off grid. We're off grid not because we're hippies or anything like that. We're off grid because it was just cheaper to be that. Connecting a farm to the electricity grid is really expensive. But the car, some quick math on all of this, it would have cost us 80,000 to get connected. Our battery electric system cost us 22,000, and the battery electric car that I drive cost us 49,000. So we ended up being, ahead basically. And we don't have electricity bills, but we've also stopped having such large petrol bills. So my husband, who is a builder, he has a very big car that chews up a lot of electricity because he's towing heavy machinery around from different job sites. But I don't really have I don't really have petrol bills anymore, and it makes a very big difference. And I suspect that you have to live that and experience that in order to really grasp just how significant an impact it has on your household, or what an impact it has on your business. So, a lot of what I know a lot more about battery electric cars and the passenger transport sector than what I do about freight. So, but I said that up front. But the point, what we have learned in the passenger vehicle sector is that there's a lot of discussion around new technologies and the potential problems, the potential downsides, and the potential benefits, but you really don't appreciate what a different technology is like until you're actually using it. And I just don't know how we get over that hurdle, because investing in battery electric freight trains is a much bigger commitment than going and investing in a battery electric car.
Definitely. Look, I think, thank you, Michelle. I think you're kind of exploring some of these areas that we can consider from that perspective. I've got some much more simpler questions with regards to, not simpler, easier. And we'll run through a few of them. Is seaweed a viable form of bio sequestration in Australia? Sequestration? Yes, biosequestration in Australia. Seaweed.
Sorry. Seaweed is another source. You can definitely do that. Personally, I think we want to try all of these different crop types. So I'm also a farmer. That's what I do in my spare time. So you've got to look at the on-land cultivation and seaweed as well. But I guess the point is this: the sooner we start that area of work, the sooner we can start hopefully absorbing the emissions we produced last year, because we're sequestering more than what we're producing at the moment. So that's another aspect to all of this. But the example that I've given with industrial hemp, that occurs because you can use industrial hemp in building, and we have a research team within our school that specialises in the use of hempcrete. The other reason why we've looked at that is because the other reason why I've mentioned that is because it's just trying to give people a sense of just what is involved. Like, it's really hard yakka to sequester carbon. We can't do it mechanically there are some countries that do, but it's not an option that's going to save the world. I think biosequestration has to play a much bigger role than what it has. And biosequestration is it's an offset. So if we've still got diesel powered freight trains running around, then a question might be, well, should those users be paying into and helping fund biosequestration programs?
I guess in line with the same question is with regards to, I think you may have partly answered it, but I'll ask the question anyway. Once the bamboo and hemp is grown, what is done with it to ensure its carbon is locked away and not re-released?
A large portion of it is locked away in the soil. So when plants are growing, they're also depositing carbon into soil, and that can help grow what we call the humus layer in the soil. The other point too, of course, is that industrial hemp, there's parts of that plant that can be locked away in building materials. So one of the I'd love to show you. So I'm actually sitting in what's a hempcrete building at the moment, and my husband, who is not a hippie, I just really want to make that very clear. My husband, who is not a hippie, is also a hempcrete building specialist. So he's probably one of the more experienced hempcrete builders in the country, and he's currently building a building in Lithgow called the Lithgow Women's Shed. And it's a very large building. It's a public building. The Lithgow Women's Shed Group were able to get a grant from the federal government from the Bushfire Recovery Fund, and hempcrete as a building material is very resistant to bushfires. And that's one of the reasons why we have built with hempcrete, because our area is very much prone to bushfire. The point to answer the question is that when it's stored in a building material, it stays in the carbon that's been absorbed stays in a non-atmospheric form for a very long time, potentially for hundreds of years.
Wow. Okay.
So it's what gets done with. And there's other issues like the circular economy. So I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but for example, we're currently involved in programs that are looking at getting a lot of materials from Sydney to make compost that then increases the organic matter within soils that then and nutrients that then enable us to grow crops like industrial hemp at much more rapid and better rates, which then enables us to sequester carbon that we then are able to turn into building products, for example, that can be sent back down the hill to Sydney, hopefully in, electrified freight locomotives, where it can be processed, or it might be processed up here. But all of that sort of thinking is very much a part of the of what's going on with this transitioning. So it's transitioning on multiple fronts and levels. It's very exciting, and it's very difficult and complex, and that can be very frightening for businesses.
Thanks, Michelle. Look, I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you for your time this afternoon to sort of present us on the work that you guys are doing, and also to have this discussion on the electrified freight locomotives and some of the practical challenges around that. And thanks everyone for being part of the webinar as well. That's all we have time for. Maybe there are a couple more questions I couldn't answer, but I appreciate all the questions that are put in place. Thank you everyone, and hope you have enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Sudan. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Cheers.